When 3 Florida women vanished over the course of 2 decades, there was nothing to suggest that there was anything linking their disappearances. Until one day when someone discovered a clue. And that clue was a man named Cleveland Hill Jr. This is the Case Remains podcast, episode 13, The Disappearances of Margaret Dash, Retha Hiers, and Donyelle Johnson. June 14th, 1974. Margaret Dash was 38 years old, married with 4 children. Margaret had been with her husband, Leon, since they were 15 and 16 years old, respectively, and had built a life together over the next 20 years. At that time, they were living in a house on Wildwood Street in Clearwater, a sunny city in Florida's Tampa Bay area. At around 11:30 in the morning, Margaret borrowed her daughter's car, a 1970 Oldsmobile Cutlass, and headed out to pick up some medication for her cousin who was sick. Her youngest daughter, Donyelle, who was 9 at the time, would later recall standing at the front door of their home and crying, wanting to join their mother on her trip to the store. Her other daughter, Elaine, still remembers what Margaret was wearing as she left their home that day. A black checkered top, black trousers, and white sandals. Sadly, neither daughter would ever see their mother again. When Margaret didn't make it home from the store, Leon drove around all night trying to find his wife, and when she still hadn't returned home by the following day, he reported her missing to the police. The missing persons report notes that she had no luggage with her, about $60 in cash, and that she had never gone missing before. A couple of months passed with no word from Margaret, and on the 15th of August, Leon received a phone call from the St. Petersburg Police Department. They informed him that the car his wife had been driving the day that she vanished had been found. The car had been reported after being abandoned for 3 days in a residential area of St. Petersburg, which is about a 5-hour drive away from Margaret's home. The car was impounded and taken to the local garage, where an officer inspected the vehicle. His report notes that the car was very clean inside, with no odour and nothing to suggest foul play. The door had been locked when they found the car and had about 3/4 of a tank of gas. With police no closer to finding Margaret, Leon enlisted the help of a private detective. A police report from September notes that Leon had hired a Tom De Robertis of Pasco Securities to attempt to locate his wife. De Robertis told police that he believed he'd found Margaret and that she was working as a private nurse for a Mrs. Thompson on Curlew Road, about an hour-and-a-half drive away from their home. Unfortunately, though, the lead turned out to be a dead end. As the years without Margaret turned into decades, tragedy struck the Dash family once more. Margaret and Leon's son, Leon Dash Jr., was murdered in 2007 after trying to break up a fight. It was early in the morning on July 30th, and 48-year-old Leon Jr. was working a new job as a security guard. He was running the door for a teenage party at the Atrium Martini Bar in downtown Clearwater. When the event was over, the revelers spilled out onto the pavement, where a fight quickly broke out. Leon Jr. tried to intervene when he was struck, falling to the floor and hitting his head. He was taken to Bayfront Health, but was pulled off life support the very next day. Leon Jr. left behind a son and a daughter, and had 1 grandchild on the way at the time of his murder. His granddaughter was born 3 days later, the very same day as his wake. Hundreds of people were outside the club when Leon Jr. was killed, yet no one came forward with any information. Police identified a person of interest and arranged a $1,000 reward, but still witnesses were proving uncooperative, prepared to let a violent criminal walk free rather than be seen as a snitch. 6 years after his death, Leon Jr.'s father and sisters, Elaine and Donyelle, made a public appeal for information in his case. While Elaine and Donyelle addressed the crowd, Leon Sr. sat in silence with his hands in his lap. Adorning the front of his white t-shirt was a picture of his late son, along with text that read, "Too well loved to ever be forgotten."
He was not just another number. He was my father's only son, our only brother, and really loving.
You need to think about it as, what if this was your brother? What if this was your mom? What if this was your sister, cousin? And somebody knew something about what happened to your relative and the way that my brother died and the force that, the things that they did to him just wasn't called for.
The press conference was staged in the Clearwater Police Department, where in the lobby was a banner displaying photos of all the victims of unsolved crime in the area. Margaret's face was up there, right along with her son. Finally, though, the Dash family would get some answers. In 2017, 10 years after Leon Jr. was killed, 38-year-old Preston Lloyd Bell was charged with manslaughter. According to Detective Hasty, who had been working on the cold case, a new eyewitness account finally confirmed what police had suspected all along. Bell had been a person of interest for quite some time and was already in police custody on unrelated charges at the time of his arrest. In fact, he'd already been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His criminal record stemmed back to 2002, when he was just 16 years old, and he has since acquired close to 50 violent and drug-related charges, including the felony murder charge for which he's currently serving his sentence. Bell is set to face trial for Leon Jr.'s murder on the 29th of July 2019. But whatever the outcome, he'll never be a free man again. In 1982, 8 years after Margaret Dash had disappeared, 43-year-old Retha Hiers woke up on a cold winter's day in Largo, Florida. It was 3 days after Christmas, and Retha's husband Howard had left early and driven down to Branton to pick up a motorcycle as a Christmas gift for their son. But when he got home, Retha was nowhere to be found. Like Margaret, she had also disappeared on her way to the store, where her daughter said she'd gone to pick up some laundry detergent. Retha, a mother of 6, had left without any other clothes or personal belongings. Again, like Margaret, her car was found abandoned several months later in the parking lot of a Clearwater apartment complex. Fast forward to 1989, when 21-year-old Donyelle Johnson vanished from Largo, the same city that Retha had called home. She was last seen on April 4th, leaving her house to go to a class at St. Petersburg Junior College. But Donyelle never made it to class that day. Her father reported her missing 2 days later, and that same day a mysterious letter arrived at his door, supposedly written by Donyelle. The letter said that she had become involved with drugs and was moving to Orlando to straighten herself out. Handwriting experts later determined that the letter had in fact been written by Donyelle. Her car was later found abandoned behind a Hardee's restaurant in Largo. A man who went by the name of Johnny Bailey had called a local towing company and told them that the car was having trouble and needed to be towed away. It later turned out, however, that the only problem with the vehicle was a loose battery connection. The true identity of Johnny Bailey has never been verified to this day. With thousands of missing persons cases reported every year, the police had no reason to believe that these 3 women's stories were related. After all, their disappearances spanned over more than 15 years. Until one day, when an investigator discovered a link. All 3 women had been romantically involved with a man named Cleveland Hill Jr. Margaret Dash had met Cleveland in 1973, just 1 year before she vanished. The two had met at the Lighthouse Church of Jesus, where Cleveland, aged 26 at the time, was a preacher, having apparently found religion during a prison furlough. Cleveland and Margaret, who was 12 years his senior, began an extramarital affair. Cleveland was eventually the one to confess to Margaret's husband Leon and apologised for what he'd done. But the affair continued for several months afterwards. Eventually, Margaret decided to end things, but told her husband Leon that when she'd done so, Cleveland had threatened to kill her. In fact, Cleveland had been named by Leon in the very first report of Margaret's disappearance. The incident with Cleveland had happened on the 10th of June, just 4 days before she disappeared. On June the 19th, a Detective Hiers contacted Cleveland, noting that he denied making any threats against Margaret or having any knowledge of her whereabouts. The same report also notes that Leon had accused Cleveland of previously keeping Margaret hid out in a motel that was located in St. Petersburg. Later that same month, Leon voluntarily came to the police station and took a polygraph test to verify the statements that he'd made in his report. The polygraph indicated that he was telling the truth. The last page of Margaret's police report is a disheartening one. Detective Hiers made 3 entries in September, November, and December of 1974. Each bear the same sentence: no new developments in case. Donyelle, the last woman to disappear, had met Cleveland through his cousin, who she had also dated. A friend of hers said that the older man had enticed her into a sexual relationship with money, giving her $600 every time he saw her, which was about 2 times a week. Cleveland showered Donyelle with expensive gifts, even a brand new $22,000 car, which her parents had made her return. They were aware of her relationship with Cleveland, and Donyelle had told them things which made them uneasy. She told her mother that Cleveland had threatened her in the past, and told her dad, Mac, about Cleveland's claims that he could make people disappear. By that time, Cleveland Hill owned a corner shop, and Mac headed over there to speak to him. He spent 6 hours there, during which time Cleveland told Mac that he was in love with his daughter. Mac replied that Donyelle was only a kid, but said that Cleveland made it very clear that he always got his way. When Cleveland was approached about Donyelle's disappearance, he told police that he'd befriended the young woman and that she was heavily involved in cocaine trafficking and may have been living in Orlando. He said that he was going there on business soon and that he would try and find her and get her to call the police. A friend of Donyelle's said that she asked Cleveland's cousin what had happened to her. He told her that she was safe and asked if she'd like to know where she was. Fearing for her life, however, she didn't take up the offer. The same cousin was interviewed by police at least 3 times in June and July of 1989, but denied knowing anything about Donyelle or the other women's disappearances. During this period, police also searched Cleveland's former home and interviewed numerous friends, family members, and employees in regards to the disappearances. Several witnesses apparently refused to talk, stating that they were scared of what Cleveland might do. Both Margaret and Retha's families also received strange letters, much like the one that Donyelle's father received a few days after she went missing. Retha's husband Howard got a letter through the door the day after his wife had disappeared, saying that she had left town with Cleveland, that he shouldn't look for her, and that their 6 children should stay with him. Like Margaret's husband Leon, Howard knew about Retha's affair. He'd caught his wife and Cleveland together, which had led to Retha taking an overdose of drugs. He and Retha had been together for 25 years by the time she disappeared, but the affair wasn't the first blow to their marriage. A report in the Tampa Bay Times recalls an incident in 1977 where Retha shot her husband with a .38 caliber pistol. It was around 9 a.m. in Clearwater when, following an argument about money, Howard had picked up a brick and smashed a car window with Retha sitting inside. Retha got out the car and shot her husband twice, hitting him once in the abdomen. Howard drove himself to the hospital while Retha went to call the police. Ultimately, though, Howard refused to press any charges against his wife. Howard was under the impression that Retha had ended her relationship with Cleveland 3 months before she disappeared, when they'd finally got married after more than 2 decades together. He went to see Cleveland, who he had considered a good friend after his wife vanished. Cleveland told him that he didn't know where she'd gone, only that she had run off with some white guy. Shortly after she vanished, Howard filed for divorce on the grounds of her adultery with Cleveland Hill Jr. Their dissolution of marriage was posted in April of 1983. Cleveland had an extensive history with the law, and his violence towards women was well documented. In 1968, aged just 20, he'd found himself arrested after shooting both his wife Betty Jean and her mother Josephine Hillman. His booking sheet states that he had shot each of them in the head, resulting in 2 charges of assault with the intent to commit murder in the first degree. Betty Jean was just 15 years old when she married Cleveland Hill, who was employed by the US Air Force at the time of his arrest. She later described her husband as very mean and said that he would call her names, lock her in the house, and beat her at least once or twice a week. After 3 years of marriage, she filed for divorce, but 4 days later, the shootings occurred. Testifying at trial, Betty Jean's mother Josephine said that before he opened fire, Cleveland had said, "I'm going to have to kill you or you'll talk." He pled not guilty on the 21st of March 1968, but was found guilty at trial just over 1 month later of a lesser charge of assault. He avoided jail time and instead was sentenced to 5 years probation. The next year, however, he violated his probation and as a result was sentenced to 10 years in prison. While incarcerated, he wrote a letter to the circuit judge which read, "My biggest problem in life has been women, and I realise this, which makes me know I'm just not ready for that kind of life. And believe me when I say there are far more important things to me now. I'm just a few weeks from being 22 years old, and I want to better my education and make something of myself." Cleveland was paroled in 1971 after spending just 2 years in prison for shooting his wife and his mother-in-law. He married Betty Jean again just 2 weeks after his release. Over the following years, Cleveland became a contractor and business owner with an extravagant home with 5 garages, a jacuzzi and a swimming pool. In 1974, he started his own asphalt and excavation company, turning over $40,000 a year, a substantial amount for the time. Despite his apparent financial success, though, Cleveland often found himself back at court for bounced checks, resulting in numerous arrests and civil judgments. His criminal record spans over 100 entries since 1968, not including the shootings which aren't available on file. Over the years, Cleveland has also been sued 3 times by women claiming that he had fathered their children. Of the 3, Cleveland lost 2 of the cases and was ordered by the court to pay child support to the claimants. To the local community, however, Cleveland was something of an economic boon, employing as many as 15 people in the area through his various businesses. One of his employees, Nathan Bostic, said, "He helped people financially by giving them work. He helped them keep their cars, loan them money. He's good for here." As a result, public opinion of Cleveland was divided. His neighbours were well aware of the rumours surrounding the missing women. Some were convinced that he had something to do with them, while others believed that everything was being exaggerated. Nevertheless, Cleveland took it upon himself to do some damage control in the neighbourhood, handing out flyers around town that placed the blame on the families of the missing women. At one point, he even claimed that he hadn't been romantically involved with any of them, but merely knew of their existence. Ironically, given his extensive criminal history, Cleveland once wrote a letter to his local newspaper regarding the community centre. Cleveland wrote about his wishes to transform the town into a, quote, "safe and secure area any one of us would be proud to call home." Just a few years after Donyelle disappeared, Cleveland found himself convicted of a string of felony charges following a drugs bust in his hometown of Largo. In 1992, undercover agents approached Henry Hill, Cleveland's brother, wanting to buy some crack cocaine. As it turned out, Henry was more inclined to trade drugs for stolen property and put them in touch with his brother instead. The undercover officers arranged an unusual trade with Cleveland, 5,000 cases of classic Coca-Cola in exchange for 350 pieces of crack cocaine and $13,000 in cash. Coca-Cola lent the bottles to the police to pass on to Cleveland, who had plans to send them on to a Tampa warehouse owned by a member of the drug ring, where they would then be sold by the Area Bay Vending Company. The sting, dubbed Operation Real Thing, resulted in the arrest of nearly 24 people, including Cleveland, his brother Henry, and the owner of the vending machine company, Anthony Peter Castellano. The then 45-year-old Cleveland was charged with conspiracy to distribute crack cocaine, a firearms violation, and 4 counts of drug possession. He claimed that he had been set up, and that he was in fact an informant for both the Pinellas County Police Department and the FBI. He had agreed to cooperate with the government, but later backed out, saying that he'd been asked to get involved with a government investigation into the Church of Scientology and that it was too dangerous. An FBI spokesperson later branded Cleveland's claims an absolute, total, pure fabrication. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 19 years, which he served in federal prison in Atlanta. His wife, Betty Jean, loyal to the end, would frequently make the 7-hour drive to visit him. Detectives had spoken to Betty Jean after Cleveland's arrest, hoping that once they got her on her own, she may have been able to give them information regarding Margaret, Retha, and Donyelle. She and her husband had argued about the women, she said, but he denied any knowledge of any of the disappearances. On June 23, 1990, Joseph Crawford, an inmate at Zephyr Hills Correctional Institute, contacted the police, telling them that he could tell them where the women's bodies were buried. Joseph had worked for Cleveland and said that he'd once seen him digging a large hole before sunrise. He didn't give them any further information, though, stating that he was worried that talking to them would endanger his 3 children, and that Cleveland had the power to get to anyone, any place, at any time. A couple of years later, an informant reached out to one of the FBI agents that had worked on Cleveland's drugs bust. They claimed that between December 1988 and January 1989, they had overheard Cleveland on the phone, telling the person on the other end, "Get rid of the bitch, just like before." They also claimed to have seen a large pool of blood in the cooler area of Cleveland's general store. The police had also received tips from various people in the local community, identifying several areas where they thought Cleveland may have buried a body. With Cleveland out of the way in prison, police made searches of several of his properties in 1993. They even excavated a vacant lot that was commonly used as a dumping ground for trash. They dug down between 9 and 11 feet deep, finding nothing but rubbish and discarded chicken bones. Today, Margaret Dash would be 83 years old, Retha Hiers would be 79, and Donyelle Johnson would be 51. They left behind parents, husbands, and siblings, not to mention the 10 sons and daughters between them. Along with Leon Dash Jr., Margaret's youngest child, Ladwayna, has also sadly since passed away, never knowing what became of her mother on that summer's morning in 1974. Cleveland was released from prison in 2008 after serving 17 years of his 19-year sentence. While he was incarcerated, his house went into foreclosure and ultimately he filed for bankruptcy, packing his bags and heading to Virginia. 10 years later, in 2018, Cleveland Hill Jr. passed away at the age of 70. According to Margaret's sister, Elaine, detectives flew to Virginia shortly before he died, hoping that he would finally offer some closure to the families of the missing women. But whatever secrets Cleveland had, he took them to his grave. Thank you for listening to episode 13 of the Case Remains podcast. You can keep in touch over on Twitter and Instagram with the handle Case Remains, or you can head over to our website, www.caseremains.com, where you'll find write-ups on missing persons cases and unsolved mysteries. Until next time, stay safe.